Emily sat down at her desk on a Tuesday morning. The clock read 8:30 a.m., and her first task of the day was to revise a report for an important meeting at 2 p.m. As she read the document's introduction, a thought stopped her. This isn't good enough yet. Instead of moving forward, she began tweaking paragraphs, changing fonts, and redoing graphics, even though she knew no one but her would notice these changes. The hours passed. By noon, Emily realized she had made little progress on the report. The time she should have spent on the main content was taken up by trivial tweaks. Anxiety began to set in. What if I don't finish on time? She thought. This worry led her to temporarily abandon the task and seek distractions on her phone. What Emily didn't realize was that procrastination was her way of coping with fear. For her, starting a task or making progress on it meant facing the risk of making a mistake, and making a mistake was something that was not part of her vocabulary. Putting things off offered a momentary relief, but it also left her panicking when deadlines loomed. However, that very day, something changed. During the meeting, her boss praised the efficiency of another colleague who had delivered a simple but functional project. Emily realized that she was stuck in a cycle of procrastination driven by her pursuit of perfection, while others prioritized results. She decided to look for ways to break this pattern. In the following days, Emily began applying a technique called the 5-minute rule. When she felt resistance to starting a task, she promised herself to work on it for just 5 minutes. Surprisingly, this small commitment was enough to overcome her inertia. Little by little, tasks that seemed impossible began to move forward. In addition, she learned to break large projects into smaller parts. Instead of writing the report, she would put in her daily plan, writing the draft introduction, or listing the key data. This helped her see each task as something more manageable, reducing her tendency to procrastinate. Emily realized that her procrastination wasn't just laziness or lack of organization, but a reflection of her fear of not meeting her own expectations. By understanding this dynamic and taking action, she began to regain control of her time. If this format is correct, I can continue with the next chapters: analysis paralysis, overwhelm, detail obsession, and so on, with the same narrative approach and depth. Let me know if you're on the right track so I can move on. The following week, Emily faced a new challenge. She was tasked with creating a presentation for an important client. Sitting at her desk, she opened PowerPoint and began to plan out the main ideas. But as she progressed, she felt a familiar unease. Is this good enough? She thought. Her mind began to race with possibilities, changing the theme colors, rearranging the slides, choosing a more impactful font. Hours later, she was still on the same page. The main content, the crux of the presentation, remained empty. Emily knew what she needed to say, but her desire to do everything perfectly kept her from moving forward. What if they don't like it? What if I look unprepared? These thoughts took over her mind, creating a roadblock. This was nothing new. Ever since she was in high school, Emily had stood out for her attention to detail. However, what had once seemed like a strength was now becoming a hindrance. She spent so much time analyzing each choice that she ended up paralyzed, unable to make decisions quickly. That night, exhausted and frustrated, Emily decided to vent to her friend Rachel. It seems like everything I do has to be revised 1,000 times before it's right, and in the end, I never feel satisfied, she confessed. Rachel, a practical and straightforward consultant, listened attentively before offering some advice. Have you ever thought about setting limits on your decisions? If you set aside 15 minutes to choose something, you might be able to move forward. This idea stuck with Emily. The next day, when she resumed her presentation, she set a clear goal: to design her presentation in 10 minutes and finish the main content by the end of the morning. Despite initial resistance, she stuck to her plan. With a timer by her side, she pushed forward even when she thought she could do a little better. In the end, she was able to put together a solid presentation in less time than she had anticipated. This small adjustment changed her perspective. Emily realized that she didn't have to get everything right the first time. She began to see decisions as steps, not final choices. If something needed to be adjusted, she could do so later. Another lesson learned came from the practice of prioritizing what really mattered. Emily began to list the 3 most important tasks for each project and focus on those before getting into the details. For example, instead of spending hours tweaking the design, she would spend her time on the main message of the presentation. This shift didn't happen overnight. There were still times when Emily was tempted to endlessly revise or reconsider every decision. But little by little, she learned to trust her judgment more and accept that good enough was often good enough. At the end of that week, she presented her proposal to the client. To her surprise, they were impressed with how clear and straightforward her presentation was. Emily realized that her fears of appearing unprepared were just reflections of her own self-criticism. With this victory, she began to build a new habit, making decisions more quickly, trusting her initial choices, and reserving in-depth analysis only for the truly crucial points. The analysis paralysis that had previously consumed her time and energy finally began to lose its grip. Emily hadn't realized it until then, but her perfectionism was also affecting her ability to say no. In an attempt to prove her competence, she took on more responsibilities than she could handle. When her boss asked for help with an extra report, she readily agreed, even though she knew she was already overwhelmed. That same week, a colleague asked her to review a project, and once again she agreed. The result was predictable. Emily spent all night working, sleeping very little, and sacrificing her weekends. By the end of Friday, her head was heavy and her eyes were red. Despite all her efforts, some important tasks had been left half done, and guilt set in. Emily felt the emotional toll that followed. One Saturday afternoon, she received a text from a friend inviting her to meet for coffee. She almost responded with an automatic yes, but hesitated. She didn't feel well, emotionally or physically. So for the first time in a long time, she decided to say no. This small choice made her think, why was it so hard to set boundaries? Why did she always say yes to everything, even when she knew it was hurting her? On Monday, during a conversation with her therapist, she brought up this issue. I feel like if I say no, people will see me as lazy or incapable. Her therapist, Jane, listened carefully before responding. Emily, saying no doesn't mean you're incapable. It means you understand your own limits and value your time. Learning to prioritize isn't just good for you, it also makes you more effective at work and in relationships. The following week, Emily decided to apply what she had learned. When a colleague asked for help with a project that was outside of her responsibilities, she took a deep breath before replying, I would really like to help, but I'm focused on finalizing my priorities for this week. Maybe we can talk about that next time. To her surprise, the colleague responded positively. He understood her point of view, and all hell didn't break loose. This small victory encouraged Emily to keep practicing. She learned that she could be helpful without overburdening herself by better balancing her responsibilities. Over time, Emily began to say no more often and to delegate tasks when possible. She also set aside fixed times in her schedule for breaks and personal time. What had once seemed selfish now became an essential self-care practice. With less overwhelm, she finally began to regain her energy and passion for her work. If you'd like, I can continue with the next chapters or adjust something specific in the narrative. Let me know so we can move forward. Emily was determined to improve her relationship with time, but there was one deeply ingrained habit she was still struggling to overcome: obsession with details. For her, every task felt like an opportunity to prove herself. It was as if any imperfection was a direct reflection of who she was as a professional and a person. That day, she had to finish a 10-page report for a client. She sat down at her desk first thing in the morning and got to work, determined to be productive. But instead of focusing on the main content, she spent 2 hours tweaking the layout. She changed the colors of the charts, changed the margins and spacing, and still wasn't satisfied. Every time she glanced at the clock, she felt panic rising. "How am I still here at the introduction?" she wondered aloud. By mid-afternoon, she realized she needed to rush to finish the rest of the report. But when she turned it in at the end of the day, her sense of relief was replaced by frustration. She knew she had spent too much time on trivial details, while the most important parts of the report had been left undeveloped. This wasn't the first time this had happened. Emily would often spend hours on tasks that others could complete in minutes. While her colleagues relied on good enough, she felt the need to revise to the point of exhaustion. This drive for perfection not only consumed her time, it also drained her energy and increased her anxiety. By the end of the day, Emily felt so overwhelmed that she decided to talk to her friend Sam, a practical and experienced project manager. He listened patiently as she described her struggle with obsessing over details. "Emily," he began, "you're spending too much time where it doesn't matter. It's like polishing a doorknob while the house is on fire." The analogy made her laugh, but it also made her think. Maybe Sam was right. Maybe she was putting too much energy into the wrong things. He continued, "Think about the impact each part of your work will have. Not everything has to be perfect. Focus on what really matters." This conversation was a turning point for Emily. The next day, she decided to try a different approach. Before she started working, she made a list of the most critical parts of the report and what would be good enough. And as she completed each task, she resisted the urge to revisit and improve, reminding herself of Sam's words. It was difficult at first. With each submission, she felt a sense of unease, as if she were leaving something unfinished. But as the days went by, she realized that no one was noticing the imperfections that worried her so much. What really mattered was the impact of her work, not the perfection of the details. To reinforce this shift, Emily began using the 80-20 rule. She learned that 80% of your results come from 20% of your efforts. This helped her prioritize the tasks that had the greatest impact and let go of the ones that were time-consuming but didn't add value. A significant shift occurred when her boss praised a report she had completed in less time. He mentioned how clear and efficient her work was, without making any remarks about the details she worried were not perfect. This encouraged her to trust the process more and let go of her need for absolute control. In addition, Emily began asking for feedback instead of holding herself to her own impossible standards. By sharing her projects with colleagues before she considered them done, she found that others were not as critical as she was. This support helped her realize that her expectations were more rigid than necessary. As the weeks went by, Emily began to notice a difference in her routine. Tasks that used to take hours to complete were now completed in less time. This made room in her schedule for new projects and even for downtime, something she had long neglected. One example of this was when she managed to finish a complex report in just 2 days, instead of the full week it would normally take. With the extra time, she was able to go out for coffee with a friend, something that had previously seemed impossible. During the conversation, her friend commented, "You seem so much lighter, Emily. What's changed?" Emily smiled, knowing that what had changed was not just her approach to work, but also her view of what really mattered. At the end of that month, Emily reviewed her progress. There were still times when she fell into the old trap of wanting everything to be perfect, but she now had tools to deal with it. By prioritizing impact over perfection, she not only regained control of her time, but she also began to enjoy her work and her personal life more. This shift didn't happen overnight, but Emily learned that the first step to overcoming her obsession with details was recognizing that absolute perfection wasn't just unnecessary, it was impossible. By focusing on the essentials, she began to build a more balanced and productive routine. If you'd like, I can continue with the next chapter. Just confirm and I'll move on. Emily was increasingly aware of the impact her perfectionism was having on her routine. However, there was one habit she still couldn't break: her inability to say no. Her need to please and prove herself was causing her to take on more responsibility than she could handle. This put her in an endless cycle of overwork, leading to burnout. That Monday, everything seemed to be happening at once. Her boss asked her to review an urgent report before the end of the day. A colleague in the IT department asked for help with a system issue, and a colleague on the marketing team asked to review an important email. Before she knew it, Emily had 3 unplanned tasks on her plate, on top of the work she had already scheduled. Her carefully planned schedule was falling apart. By noon, her mind was racing, trying to do everything at once. During lunch, or rather, while hurriedly munching on a granola bar, she realized her anxiety was at an all-time high. Why did I take on all of this? She thought. But the answer was already in her mind. Saying no felt like an act of failure. This dynamic was nothing new. Ever since she was a little girl, Emily had been praised for being responsible and dedicated. Whenever someone needed help, she was the first to volunteer. This continued at work, where she became known as the person who always got it done. But this habit of taking on everything was taking a toll. That night, exhausted and lacking the energy to even eat dinner, Emily reflected on what her therapist, Jane, had said in a previous session. Saying no doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're prioritizing your time and energy. You can't help anyone if you're exhausted. Those words echoed in her mind as she drifted off to sleep. The next day, Emily decided to try a different approach. When a colleague showed up at her desk asking for help with a last-minute project, she took a deep breath before responding. "I'd love to help, but I'm on a tight schedule today. Maybe we can go over this together tomorrow." To her surprise, the colleague accepted her answer without question. This small step was a game changer. Emily realized that by setting boundaries, she was protecting her time without damaging her relationships. In fact, the way she expressed her position, clearly and respectfully, made people respect her even more. Over the next few weeks, Emily began practicing what she called strategic negotiation. When she received a request, she would first assess her schedule. If the request was inconsistent with his priorities, he would find a way to offer an alternative or redirect the request to someone else. "I'd like to help, but my schedule is full. Maybe the support team can help with that," became one of his go-to responses. In addition to saying no when necessary, Emily began delegating tasks. Previously, she believed she had to do everything herself to ensure it was perfect. But now that her schedule was more balanced, she found that relying on her colleagues not only lightened her load, but also strengthened teamwork. One of the biggest changes came when she set aside set times for herself. For example, she blocked out the last hour of every Friday to organize her schedule for the following week and review what she had accomplished. These moments of reflection helped her recognize patterns and adjust her approach as needed. Emily also began to notice how the overload was impacting her personal life. Before, she would often cancel appointments with friends and family because she was always too busy. Now, by setting boundaries at work, she began to reclaim that time. One Saturday, she finally accepted an invitation to dinner with friends that she had been putting off for weeks. During the conversation, they commented, "You seem so much more relaxed, Emily. What's changed?" She smiled, knowing that it wasn't a complete transformation, but rather a steady progress. "I'm learning not to say yes to everything," she replied, "and I've found that it makes a huge difference." At work, the benefits became clear too. Her projects were being delivered on time, with consistent quality, and her team began to trust her more as a leader. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, Emily began to enjoy her work again. Tasks that had previously seemed impossible were now manageable. Even so, there were setbacks. Some days she would still say yes when she should have said no, But instead of beating herself up, Emily saw it as a learning opportunity. Every no she managed to say was a step toward a more balanced life. By the end of that month, Emily realized that the key to avoiding overwhelm was not just saying no, but also prioritizing what was most important to her. Setting boundaries didn't make her less capable. In fact, it made her a more effective professional and a more present person. With that lesson in mind, Emily continued to adjust her approach. She was far from perfect, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had room to breathe. The simple act of protecting her time helped her regain her energy, her balance, and most importantly, her peace of mind. If you'd like, I can continue with the next chapter. Please confirm so we can move forward. As the months passed, Emily began to realize that her efforts to curb procrastination, overcome analysis paralysis, and deal with overwhelm were working. But even with these improvements, something was still missing. She felt she needed a system that would structure her day more effectively, a tool that could guide her through daily choices and help her avoid relapses. It was during a conversation with Jane, her therapist, that Emily first heard about the concept of time blocking. Jane explained that the technique involved dividing the day into specific blocks of time, dedicating each block to a single task or activity. Think of it as a schedule that you create for yourself. It's not rigid, but it provides a framework for you to work with focus and intention. The idea intrigued Emily. She had tried to do lists and reminders on her phone, but these tools seemed to fall apart whenever unexpected events arose. With time blocking, Jane suggested that Emily could allocate time not only for her obligations, but also for breaks, recreation, and self-care. At first, Emily was skeptical. What if I can't stick to the plan? What if something unexpected comes up? Jane smiled and replied, "The idea is not to create a perfect schedule, but to give you a basis to organize yourself while still being flexible." That night, Emily decided to give it a try. She grabbed a simple notebook and started planning the next day. She divided the hours into blocks and assigned a specific task to each block. For example, from 9 to 10 a.m., she would review a report. From 10 to 10:30 a.m., she would answer emails. From 12 to 1 p.m., she would take a break to eat lunch without checking her phone. When her alarm went off the next morning, Emily felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. She grabbed her notebook and went about her morning routine, which now included 15 minutes of meditation before starting work. This first block brought her a sense of calm that she hadn't experienced in a long time. As the day went on, Emily discovered the immediate benefits of time blocking. By knowing exactly what she needed to do at any given moment, she avoided distractions and worked with greater focus. When the clock struck 10:30 a.m., she realized that she had completed the review of the report, something that would have taken her twice as long before. The satisfaction of crossing a task off her list was indescribable. However, the day wasn't perfect. In the afternoon, an unexpected meeting interrupted her planning. Emily had to adjust the block she was working on, moving some tasks to the next day. Instead of getting frustrated, she remembered Jane's words, "Flexibility is part of the process." This mindset helped her to see adjustments as a natural part of the method. Over the next few days, Emily refined her approach. She found that she needed to be more realistic when planning time blocks, leaving larger gaps for more complex tasks. She also started setting aside specific blocks for unexpected events, such as last-minute meetings or urgent demands. One of the biggest benefits of time blocking was the intentional inclusion of breaks. Emily had previously felt that she needed to work non-stop to be productive, but now she saw that breaks were essential to recharging her batteries. During these breaks, she would do something she enjoyed, like walking outside or listening to music. These short breaks transformed her routine, making it lighter and more balanced. Another positive was the clarity that the method brought to her personal life. Emily began to block out time for hobbies that she had neglected, like drawing and cooking. She also set aside Friday nights to go out with friends, something that had previously seemed impossible in her hectic schedule. The transformation was so significant that her co-workers began to notice. "Emily, how do you manage to get everything done without looking overwhelmed?" asked Anna, a colleague in the marketing department. Emily laughed and replied, "It's time blocking. It sounds simple, but it changed my life." Excited by the results, Emily decided to share the method with her team during a brainstorming meeting. She explained how she organized her day, showed examples of her time blocks, and gave practical tips for getting started. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and some of her colleagues began adopting the technique as well. Over time blocking became more than a productivity tool for Emily. It was a way to prioritize what really mattered. Each block of time represented a conscious choice to focus on work, self-care, or connecting with loved ones. There were still tough days, of course. Some plans fell apart due to unexpected events, and Emily still struggled with the temptation to cram too many tasks into her blocks. But now she knew how to adjust, reset, and move forward. At the end of that month, Emily sat down with her notebook and reviewed the results. She realized that she was not only more productive, but also more calm and present. For the first time in years, she felt like she was in control of her time, and more importantly, her life. If you'd like, I can continue with the next chapters to complete the script. Let me know, and I'll keep writing. Over the next few weeks, Emily began to realize something important. Small victories were just as meaningful as big milestones. Previously, she had only allowed herself to feel proud when she completed a huge project or received praise from her boss. But with time blocking, she learned to appreciate the moments when, even in the midst of chaos, she managed to complete a task or stick to her plan. One day, Emily had a particularly challenging morning. An unexpected meeting with the finance department took over 2 hours, throwing her entire schedule off track. In the past, she would have felt defeated, thinking that the day was lost. But this time, she decided to reevaluate her priorities. She grabbed her notebook, rearranged her afternoon blocks, and focused only on the most essential tasks. Despite the delay, Emily managed to finish a critical report ahead of schedule. As she crossed the task off her list, she felt a surge of satisfaction. It wasn't just the outcome that made her feel good, but the fact that she had remained calm and adapted to the unexpected. For the first time, she realized that progress, even small ones, was a reason to celebrate. This change in mindset began to affect other aspects of her life. Before, Emily felt like she never had time for friends or herself, but now, when planning her day, she made sure to include blocks of time dedicated to leisure and self-care. One Friday night, for example, she went to the movies with her friend Rachel, something she hadn't done in months. During the meeting, Rachel commented, "You seem more relaxed, Emily. What's changed?" Emily laughed, realizing that this calmness came from the small choices she was making each day. She told Rachel about time blocking and how it helped her balance her work and personal life. "It's like I finally have room to breathe," she said. Another defining moment happened one Saturday. Emily had planned to spend the morning organizing her apartment, but when she woke up, she realized she was exhausted. Instead of forcing herself to stick to her plan, she decided to do something different. She spent the morning drawing, a passion she had abandoned years ago. As she scribbled in her sketchbook, she felt light, almost as if she were recharging her batteries. These small, intentional breaks became part of her routine. Emily realized that moments of disconnection, walking in the park, listening to her favorite music, having a leisurely coffee, were essential to her well-being. They weren't wasted time, but rather investments in her mental health. At work, Emily also began to notice the benefits of appreciating small wins. During a presentation for a client, she made a small mistake while showing a chart. In the past, this would have ruined her day, but now, instead of beating herself up, she decided to continue with confidence. At the end, the client complimented her clarity and ability to answer questions assertively. Emily realized that the mistake wasn't as important as her attitude. To reinforce this new approach, she started writing in a journal of accomplishments every night. It didn't have to be something grand. It could be as simple as, "I completed the report on time," or "I had a peaceful dinner with my friend." This habit helped her recognize daily progress and move away from the all-or-nothing mentality that had previously paralyzed her. Over time, Emily began sharing this idea with her colleagues. At a team meeting, she suggested that each person list one positive thing they had accomplished during the week. At first, everyone laughed, thinking it was a simplistic idea. But as they began to participate, they realized how motivating it was to recognize these small victories. These changes didn't mean that Emily never had bad days. There were still times when she felt like she was losing control or that she hadn't done enough. But now, instead of beating herself up, she remembered the small wins she had accumulated along the way. This gave her the strength to start over the next day. At the end of that month, Emily reflected on her journey. It was far from perfect. She still had challenges to overcome and habits to adjust. But as she looked back at her journal entries, she realized that she was building a solid foundation. Each small victory was a building block in this process, and together they were transforming her life. If you'd like, I can continue with the next chapter. Check it out so I can move on. As time went on, the changes in Emily's routine began to spill over into her personal life. Before, her obsession with work and perfection took up so much space that she distanced herself from friends, neglected her family, and put aside her own passions. Now, with time blocking and a more balanced approach, she was reconnecting with those connections and rediscovering parts of herself that she had lost. One day, as Emily reviewed her weekly schedule, she noticed something she had never noticed before. There were blank spaces. For the first time, there was no overload of tasks or conflicting commitments. Instead, these free blocks represented opportunities. "What do I want to do with this time?" she thought. The answer came with a smile. Call her mother. It was a simple thing, but one that Emily had been putting off for weeks. With each missed call, she promised to call back later, but that later never came. That night, she picked up the phone and dialed the number. Her mother answered on the second ring, her tone warm and slightly surprised. "Emily, it's so good to hear from you. I thought you were too busy to talk to me." Emily laughed, but her heart sank slightly. She knew her absence was unintentional, but the impact was real. During the conversation, she talked about the changes she was making and how she was learning to balance her life. Her mother, always a supportive figure, praised her efforts. "I'm so proud of you, honey. Remember, you don't have to do it all alone." This conversation had a profound impact. Emily realized that by prioritizing work above all else, she was sacrificing the connections that truly mattered. She decided to build regular blocks into her schedule for family conversations, whether they were phone calls or visits. These moments became a ritual, something she looked forward to each week. The changes also began to affect her friendships. Emily always had an excuse to decline invitations. "I'm too busy. I need to work on this report," or "maybe next time." But as her routine became more balanced, she began to say yes more often. One Friday night, she accepted an invitation to dinner with a group of friends she hadn't seen in months. When she arrived at the restaurant, she felt a familiar warmth upon seeing them again. "Look who decided to leave the office," joked Sam, her closest friend. Emily laughed, knowing the joke was deserved. During dinner, the conversation flowed naturally. Emily realized she had missed these light-hearted, carefree interactions. More importantly, she realized that her friends accepted her for who she was, even with all her insecurities. By the end of the night, she felt reinvigorated and promised herself that she would never let these moments slip away again. In addition to relationships, Emily began to reconnect with her own passions. One of them was drawing, something she had loved since childhood but had abandoned in adulthood. One Saturday afternoon, as she flipped through an old sketchbook, she felt a wave of nostalgia. She decided to set aside a block of time just to draw, without expectations or judgment. That day, she sat down at her living room table with a pencil and paper and began to scribble. At first, she felt rusty, but as the minutes passed, she became lost in the activity. When she looked at the clock, 2 hours had passed. Emily realized that there was something deeply therapeutic about dedicating time to something that made her happy, without any pressure to be good or productive. These moments of self-care began to become more frequent. Emily would set aside blocks of time to walk in the park, try new recipes in the kitchen, or simply read a book with a cup of tea. These activities, which had previously seemed like impossible luxuries, were now essential parts of her routine. At work, the change was also noticeable. Emily was calmer, more present and more focused. Her colleagues noticed the difference. "You look different, Emily," commented Anna, her colleague. "It seems like you finally found your balance." Emily smiled, knowing that she was far from perfect, but acknowledging the progress she had made. At the end of a particularly challenging month, Emily reviewed her schedule. She realized that she had achieved a balance between work, personal life, and self-care in a way she never thought possible. Most importantly, she realized that she was happier, not because she had achieved some grandiose goal, but because she was present in her own life. Emily learned that true balance wasn't about having everything under control all the time, but about making intentional choices that reflected her priorities. With every conversation with her mom, every dinner with friends, and every sketch she scribbled on paper, she was building a fuller, more meaningful life. If you'd like, I can continue with the next chapter, detailing the impact of Emily's approach on her confidence and the final adjustments to her journey. Please confirm so we can move forward. As the months passed, Emily began to notice something surprising. She was regaining her confidence. Before, her self-esteem was directly tied to perfection in her work. Any mistake, no matter how small, was seen as a personal failure. But now, with the changes in her routine and mindset, Emily began to realize that her self-worth didn't have to depend on flawless performance. It all started at a weekly team meeting. Emily was tasked with presenting an idea for a new project, something that in the past would have left her anxious for days. But that morning, as she organized her time blocks, she realized that she could plan her presentation simply and to the point, without getting bogged down in unnecessary details. During the meeting, her direct and well-structured approach impressed her boss. At the end, he said, "Emily, this is exactly the kind of clarity we need. Great job." She thanked him, feeling proud, but for the first time without the need to dissect every word spoken to assess whether she could have done something better. The recognition was welcome, but Emily knew that her true achievement was internal, the confidence in her ability to deliver solid work. This new perspective began to reflect in other areas. Emily noticed that the changes in her routine helped her feel more in control. With time blocking, she could visualize her priorities and deal with unexpected events without feeling like the world was falling apart. This sense of security was essential to strengthening her self-esteem. But progress wasn't linear. One day, during a particularly stressful project, Emily found herself slipping back into old habits. She spent hours tweaking irrelevant details of a report, letting other important tasks pile up. When she realized her mistake, she felt a wave of frustration. "Why do I still do this?" she thought. Instead of beating herself up, Emily used the experience as a learning opportunity. That night, she reviewed her plan and made a note in her notebook. "Not every day is going to be perfect, and that's okay. The important thing is to keep trying." That simple phrase helped her regain perspective. Emily was learning to be kinder to herself, an essential step in her journey to self-confidence. Another important milestone came during a meeting with Jane, her therapist. Emily shared her recent victories and challenges, including the report incident. Jane smiled and said, "Emily, progress isn't about never making mistakes. It's about how you respond to them, and you're responding in a much healthier way now." Those words echoed in Emily's mind over the next few weeks. She began to see her mistakes as part of the process, rather than evidence of inadequacy. When something went wrong, she made adjustments and moved on, rather than dwelling on what she couldn't change. Emily's newfound confidence also began to influence her personal interactions. Previously, she had struggled to speak up or set clear boundaries, fearing she would disappoint others. But now, with greater clarity about her priorities, she began to feel more comfortable saying no when necessary. One afternoon, a colleague asked Emily to take on a part of a project that wasn't her responsibility. In the past, she would have immediately agreed, fearing she would seem uncooperative. But this time, she calmly responded, "I'd love to help, but I'm very busy this week. Maybe we can talk about this another time." Her colleague agreed without hesitation, and Emily felt a surge of relief and pride. These small changes began to compound, creating a solid foundation for her self-confidence. Emily realized that she was beginning to value her own needs and opinions more, rather than relying solely on external validation. One of the biggest signs of her progress came during a presentation to a group of clients. During the Q&A session, one of the participants offered constructive criticism of one of her proposals. In the past, Emily would have taken this as a personal attack. But now, with her new mindset, she was able to listen to the criticism with maturity and respond constructively. At the end, the client praised her professional demeanor, reinforcing the confidence Emily was building in herself. At the end of the quarter, Emily reflected on her journey thus far. The changes in her routine and mindset had not only transformed her productivity, but also her perception of herself. She was no longer trapped by perfectionism or the approval of others. Instead, she was learning to trust her abilities and value her own progress, regardless of what the world around her said. Emily knew there was still work to do, but for the first time in a long time, she was excited about the future. Each small step towards self-confidence was proof that she was on the right path, a path she was creating for herself, with intention and purpose. If you'd like, I can continue with the next chapter, exploring how Emily consolidated these changes into a sustainable lifestyle. Check it out so I can follow along. Emily was approaching a major milestone in her journey, turning the changes she had been implementing into sustainable habits. With time blocking as a go-to tool and her confidence growing, she began to realize that the next step was to integrate these practices into all areas of her life, creating a balance that she could maintain long-term. One Monday morning, as Emily reviewed her notebook, she noticed how her schedule had changed over the past few weeks. Before, each day had been packed to the brim, with no room for breaks or unexpected events. Now, her time blocks included not only work tasks, but also moments of leisure, self-care, and interaction with loved ones. For the first time, her routine felt more human and less mechanical. That week, Emily decided to adjust something that still bothered her, the lack of consistency in her mornings. She noticed that on days when she started calmly and intentionally, her productivity and mood were much higher. Inspired by personal development books and conversations with her therapist, she decided to create a simple but meaningful morning routine. At 6:30 the next morning, Emily woke to the soft sound of her alarm, a soothing tune she'd chosen to replace the shrill ringtone that usually triggered her anxiety. Instead of immediately reaching for her phone, she headed to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea. She sat down at the table with her notebook and took 10 minutes to write down what she was looking for. Then she set aside 15 minutes to stretch her body, something she had neglected for years. As she did the movements, she felt grateful for taking care of herself. Finally, she quickly reviewed her schedule, making sure she had enough room for breaks and adjustments, in case things got out of hand. This routine, while simple, brought her a sense of control and clarity that carried over to the rest of her day. Emily noticed that by starting with intention, she was less likely to feel overwhelmed. From that day on, She made her morning routine a non-negotiable habit, adjusting it as needed, but always focusing on starting off strong. Another aspect Emily worked to solidify was her work-life balance. With time blocking, she was able to set aside evenings for herself, something that had previously seemed impossible. Instead of answering emails or reviewing reports late at night, she used that time for relaxing activities like reading, watching a TV show, or calling a friend. One day, after a long workday, Emily received a message from her boss asking her to review a document before the next day. In the past, she would have dropped everything to comply with the request. But now, with her new approach, she politely responded, "I can review this tomorrow morning before the meeting. I need time to rest tonight." To her surprise, her boss accepted without question, and Emily felt that her boundaries were being respected. This new dynamic brought more energy and focus to her work. During a team meeting, Emily presented an innovative proposal that received immediate praise. A colleague commented, "You seem so at ease, Emily. How do you manage all this?" She smiled, knowing that the key was not to work harder, but to work with intention. On a personal level, Emily continued to strengthen her relationships. Now, weekly calls with her mother were something they both looked forward to. Her once infrequent and apologetic get-togethers with friends became a regular part of her routine. Even her hobbies, like drawing and cooking, became more commonplace. Emily realized that by nurturing these areas, she was investing in her own happiness and balance. Despite all the progress she had made, Emily knew the challenge was maintaining this new approach over the long term. One Sunday evening, as she reviewed her schedule for the upcoming week, she thought about how she could avoid falling behind. She decided to implement 3 basic rules. 1. Weekly review. Every Sunday, she would set aside an hour to review her schedule, reflect on successes and adjustments needed, and plan for the upcoming week. 2. Intentional flexibility. She would leave open blocks in her schedule to deal with unexpected events, ensuring that small setbacks didn't derail her routine. 3. Regular breaks. She would continue to prioritize moments of disconnection and self-care, reminding herself that rest was not a waste of time, but an essential component of her productivity and well-being. These practices helped Emily cement the changes she had been making. Most importantly, they taught her to be kind to herself. There were days when her planning didn't work, or when she felt overwhelmed, but now she knew that these moments were part of the process, not a failure. By the end of that month, Emily felt more at peace than ever. Her mornings were calm and structured, her afternoons productive, and her evenings reserved for what really mattered. For the first time, she felt like she was living according to her priorities, rather than just reacting to external demands. Emily still had a lot to learn, but she now knew she had the tools and mindset to keep growing. The journey wasn't about achieving perfection, but about building a life that reflected what was most important to her, a life of balance, intention, and purpose. If you'd like, I can expand on the epilogue or address a specific aspect of the story. Let me know, and I'll keep going. Months had passed since Emily began her transformation, and while progress was evident, she knew that learning never ends. The balance she had found in her routine, her renewed confidence, and her strengthened relationships were the result of continued effort. But Emily also realized something crucial. The true value of her journey was not in reaching a final destination, but in the ability to adapt and grow along the way. One quiet afternoon, Emily was reviewing her time-blocking notebook. As she flipped through the pages, she saw how her notes had changed over time. At first, they were full of uncertainty and constant adjustments. Now her weeks were more organized, reflecting a healthy balance of work, play, and self-care. Each page told a story of determination, learning, and above all, resilience. Emily reflected on the impact this transformation had had on her life. At work, she was seen as an effective and reliable leader, someone who knew how to prioritize and deliver results without compromising her well-being. At home, Her connections with friends and family were stronger than ever, and within herself there was a peace she never imagined possible. But Emily also knew there would be hard days. She knew perfectionism might still creep in, that the urge to say yes to everything might return. But the difference now was that she had the tools to deal with those moments. She knew how to reassess, adjust, and move forward without letting guilt or anxiety consume her. That very day, Emily decided to write a letter to herself as a reminder for the future. Pen in hand, she began. Dear Emily, I am so proud of where you have come. It hasn't been easy, but you have proven to yourself that you are capable of change, growth, and living a more balanced life. Remember that progress is never linear, and it's okay to have tough days. What matters is how you choose to respond. Continue to prioritize what truly matters. Say yes to what brings you joy and no to what only drains your energy. Make time for the people you love and for yourself. Remember that perfection is not the goal. The goal is to live a life aligned with your values. Above all, be kind to yourself. You are stronger and more capable than you realize. Love, Emily. She folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer in her desk, where she knew she would find it on days when she needed a reminder of her own strength. As the sun set that afternoon, Emily felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. She knew the journey would never be perfect, but she also knew she had achieved something much greater than efficiency or productivity. She had achieved herself. And so, with time blocking as her compass, with confidence as her fuel, and with balance as her destination, Emily continued her journey, a journey of purpose, intention, and constant evolution.